The letter arrived on a cold October morning, carried by a rider who looked too grand for the dusty road that led to the small parsonage in Willow Creek, Colorado. Abigail Harper was the one who opened the door, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, expecting nothing more than a delivery for her father's church records. Instead, the rider removed his hat with careful respect and handed her an envelope sealed in deep red wax. The paper was thick and smooth beneath her fingers. Her name was written in strong, careful handwriting. Miss Abigail Harper. She stood by the window after the rider left, holding the letter up to the light. She could see the faint mark of a fine paper mill pressed into it. No one had ever sent her anything so grand before. Her father, Reverend Samuel Harper, looked up from his worn Bible. "Who would be writing to you in such fashion, Abby?" "I believe," she said softly, her heart already beating faster. "It is from him." 3 months earlier, a notice had appeared in a Denver newspaper that a traveling merchant left behind in their town. It was not like any announcement Abigail had ever seen. A duke recently returned from war seeks a wife through honest correspondence, not for wealth or status, but for companionship and understanding. Ladies of sincere heart may write. Most in Willow Creek had laughed at it. A duke in America sounded like something from a fairy tale, but the title was old and real. Duke Nathaniel Hawthorne of Black Ridge Manor. His family had settled in Colorado decades ago after leaving England. The title had followed them, though the land was wild and far from European courts. Its Abigail had read the notice 3 times that night by lantern light. She did not dream of gowns or grand parties. She dreamed of books, of deep conversation, of a life that meant something more than sewing and church suppers. So she had written a simple letter. She had not expected a reply. But one had come, then another, then many more. Now she broke the seal with trembling hands. "Dear Miss Harper, your last letter reached me during a storm that rattled the windows of this old house. I confess, your words brought more light than the sun has managed in weeks. You write not as a woman seeking position, but as one seeking truth. That alone sets you apart from the others." Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks. For weeks they had written to one another. Nathaniel had told her of Black Ridge Manor, built of dark stone against the mountains. He had told her of the war he fought in Cuba, of the scar that crossed his face, of nights when sleep refused to come. He never hid his flaws. "I am not an easy man," he once wrote. "I am marked by things I have seen. 7 women have come to Black Ridge in the past months. 7 have left within days. They found the house too lonely. They found me too changed." Abigail remembered reading those lines by candlelight, her chest tight with something that felt like both fear and tenderness. In this new letter, his words were steady and direct. "If you still wish to come to Black Ridge Manor, the carriage will arrive for you on the 15th. I will understand if you choose not to accept. But I would rather face rejection with honesty than live forever wondering what might have been." And her father watched her closely. "Well?" She folded the letter carefully. "He has invited me to visit." Reverend Harper leaned back slowly. He was a kind man, with silver hair and gentle eyes. "You have never traveled beyond Denver, Abby." "I know." "He is a stranger." "Yes. And yet you have been smiling at those letters for weeks." She looked down at her hands. "He writes like a man who has been alone too long." Her father was quiet for a moment. "Do you trust him?" She thought of the way Nathaniel described the sunrise over the mountains, the way he spoke of his fear that he had become too hardened for love, the way he asked about her thoughts on books rather than her dowry. "Yes," she said finally. "I trust the man in the letters." 2 weeks later, Abigail stood beside a modest trunk as a black carriage pulled up to the parsonage. Neighbors gathered at their fences, whispering. Some shook their heads. "He'll send her back by winter," one woman muttered. Abigail heard it. She lifted her chin. The journey to Black Ridge Manor took nearly 2 days. As the carriage climbed higher into the Rockies, the land grew wilder. Pine trees thickened along steep hillsides. The sky seemed larger, heavier with clouds. The driver cleared his throat as they rounded the final bend. "There it is, miss." Abigail leaned forward. Black Ridge Manor rose from the mountainside like something carved from shadow. Dark stone walls stood against gray sky. Tall, narrow windows reflected the coming storm. The roofline cut sharp against the clouds. It was beautiful, and it was lonely. Yet the air felt still as the carriage rolled up the long gravel drive. No neighboring houses sat nearby. No town lights flickered in the distance. Only mountains and silence surrounded it. She understood, in that moment, why others had fled. The carriage stopped before massive oak doors. They opened before she could knock. He stood there waiting. Nathaniel Hawthorne was taller than she imagined. Broad shoulders filled his dark coat. His hair was black and slightly longer than fashion demanded. A scar ran from his right temple down across his cheek toward his jaw. It was not small. It was not easy to ignore. His gray eyes held something deeper than pain. They held caution. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice low and steady. "You came." Abigail stepped down from the carriage. The wind tugged at her plain brown dress and loose curls. Did you believe I would not?" A faint smile touched his mouth. 7 others did not stay. She looked past him at the towering manor, then back at his face. "Perhaps they were looking for something else. And what are you looking for?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze without flinching. "The truth." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, respect, maybe even hope. He stepped aside. "Then welcome to Black Ridge Manor." Inside, the house was grand but heavy. High ceilings, long hallways lined with old portraits, large fireplaces that seemed built to fight endless winters. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and polished stone. A housekeeper showed Abigail to her room. It overlooked the mountains. The bed was large and carved from dark oak. Fresh wildflowers sat on the table beside the window. But Nathaniel lingered near the doorway. "Dinner is at 8, he said. "If you wish to leave before then, the carriage can return you in the morning." She almost laughed. "I have just arrived." He studied her face carefully, as though expecting to see fear bloom at any moment. Instead, she walked to the window and gazed at the mountains painted in fading light. "It is not cursed," she said softly. "It is only quiet." He did not answer right away. Finally, he said, "Most mistake the two." When he left, Abigail placed her hand over her racing heart. The house was imposing, the silence deep, the man scarred and guarded. But beneath it all, she felt something steady. That night, dressed in her simplest blue gown, she entered the dining room, where candles cast warm light against dark walls. Nathaniel stood when she entered. "Up, you look," he paused, searching for the right word. "Brave." She smiled gently. "And you look exactly as you described." Dinner passed in quiet conversation at first, but soon they spoke as they had in letters, about books, about the war, about fear and loneliness. "You are not frightened?" he asked finally. "I was," she admitted, "but not of you." "Of what then?" "Of turning back and always wondering." For the first time, his guarded expression softened completely. Outside, the wind moved through the mountains. Inside Black Ridge Manor, 2 lonely souls sat across from one another, both aware that something important had begun. And for the first time since 7 women had fled these halls, Duke Nathaniel Hawthorne allowed himself to hope that this one might stay. Abigail woke before dawn on her second morning at Black Ridge Manor. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she saw the tall stone walls, the heavy curtains, and beyond the window, the pale blue outline of the Rocky Mountains. The silence was deep, but it did not frighten her. It felt honest. She dressed quickly in a warm wool gown and stepped into the hallway. The manor was quiet at that early hour. A faint glow of light came from beneath one door at the end of the corridor. She followed it. The library was larger than the church back home. The shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound books. A fire burned low in the hearth. Nathaniel sat at a wide desk near the window, a letter half-written before him. He looked up at the sound of her steps. For a moment his face held surprise, then something warmer. "You are awake early," he said. "I wish to see the house in the morning light," Abigail replied. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "You are not." He set his pen down. "I was writing to a supplier in Denver. Old habits. I rise before the sun." She walked slowly along the shelves, running her fingers across the spines of books. History, poetry, philosophy, medical texts. "You have more books than the university," she said softly. "They keep the house from feeling empty," he answered. She turned to face him. Does it still feel empty?" He did not look away from her. "Less than it did yesterday." The words hung between them. After breakfast, he offered to show her the grounds. The air was crisp, the sky clear. Black Ridge Manor stood on a wide stretch of land that rolled down toward a river below. Pine trees bordered the estate. In the distance, snow-capped peaks rose like silent guardians. They walked side by side along a stone path. "The others," Abigail said carefully. "What frightened them most?" Nathaniel gave a quiet breath. The quiet. The isolation. Some said the house felt like a tomb. Others said my face unsettled them. His hand lifted slightly toward his scar, then dropped. Abigail stopped walking. "May I ask about it?" He hesitated, then nodded. "A Spanish officer, close combat." "I was fortunate." "Fortunate?" she asked gently. "I lived." There was no self-pity in his voice, only fact. She stepped closer, studying the thin, pale line that cut across his skin. It did not make him less handsome. It made him real. "You wrote that it changed you," she said. It did. His gray eyes darkened. "War takes something from a man. Sleep, ease, sometimes softness. And what does it give?" He seemed surprised by the question. "Memories," he said at last. "Some I would gladly return." She considered that quietly. "My father says wounds are proof that the body fought to survive. Perhaps the soul is the same." Nathaniel looked at her in a way that made her heart beat faster. Not with fear, but with recognition. "You do not pity me," he said. "But no, you do not flinch. No. Why?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Because you were brave enough to tell me the truth before I ever arrived. I knew who you were." Something in his posture shifted, as though a weight he had carried alone had grown lighter. They spent the morning riding across the property. Abigail had learned to ride on borrowed horses in Willow Creek. Nathaniel watched her carefully at first, but soon realized she handled the spirited mare with steady confidence. They rode toward an old wooden barn near the river. A group of ranch hands paused in their work to stare. No woman had lasted long enough to be seen on these grounds more than once. One man tipped his hat politely. "Mornin', Your Grace." Nathaniel nodded, but his attention remained on Abigail. "Yeah, do they think I will leave?" she asked quietly, once they were out of earshot. "Yes," he answered honestly. "And you?" He was silent for a long moment. "I do not know what to think," he admitted. "I have hoped before." She understood more than he realized. Hope could be dangerous when it had been broken many times. That evening they dined again by candlelight. The conversation flowed easier now. He laughed once at her teasing remark about the serious expression in one of his ancestors' portraits. "You are bold," he said. "I am practical," she replied. "If I were frightened of serious faces, I would have left yesterday." His laughter this time was deeper, freer. After dinner, he led her up a narrow staircase she had not yet explored. The steps wound upward into one of the towers. What at the top was a circular room with wide windows on every side. A telescope stood near the east wall. 2 chairs faced the mountains. "This is where I think," he said quietly. "Where I come when the house feels too large." Abigail moved to the window. The sun had set, and the sky burned with streaks of orange and purple over the peaks. The valley below looked endless. "It is not lonely," she whispered. "It is grand." The others said it felt like standing at the edge of the world. She smiled faintly. Perhaps they feared falling. He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she felt his warmth. "And you?" "I have always wanted to see beyond the edge." He studied her face as though trying to understand how a vicar's daughter from a small town could stand so steady in a place that frightened women raised in wealth. "Why did you truly come, Abigail?" he asked softly. "You could have married someone safe, someone near home." She turned to him fully. "Because your letters felt alive. Because you spoke of fear without shame. Because you asked me what I thought, instead of what I could offer." His breath seemed to catch. "I am not easy to love," he said quietly. "Neither am I," she answered. "I speak my mind. I question things. I do not pretend to be small." A faint smile touched his mouth. "Good." Silence settled between them, but it was no longer heavy. It felt shared. Over the next days, they fell into a rhythm. Mornings in the library reading side by side. Afternoons riding or walking by the river. Evenings speaking of dreams they had never dared voice aloud. He confessed that after the war, he had nearly sold the estate, but the silence had pressed too hard against his thoughts. "What stopped you?" she asked. "Pride," he admitted, "and fear of appearing weak." She shook her head gently. "Staying does not make you weak." "And you?" he asked one afternoon, as they sat beneath a tall pine. "What do you fear?" She was quiet for a moment. "I fear living a small life when I was meant for more," she said. "I fear becoming silent to please others." "You will never be silent here," he said firmly. The promise in his voice made her chest tighten. By the end of the week, the servants no longer watched her with quiet sympathy. They began to greet her with cautious respect. She asked the cook about meals. She spoke kindly to the stable hands. She treated the house not as a visitor, but as someone who might belong. Nathaniel saw it. One evening, and as snow began to fall lightly outside, they stood once more in the tower room. "I told myself I would not ask this again," he said, his voice lower than usual. "But I must know. Are you certain you wish to stay longer?" Abigail stepped closer to him. "I did not come for a visit," she said softly. His gray eyes searched her face for doubt, and found none. "You understand what that means," he said. "Marriage to me is not a title and fine gowns. It is this house, these mountains, my scars, my silence when memories return." "And marriage to me," she replied steadily, "means my opinions, my questions, my stubborn heart, and my refusal to abandon you when the silence grows heavy." The wind moved outside the tower windows. Nathaniel reached up slowly, as though afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. "May I?" he asked quietly. She nodded. His hand brushed against her cheek, careful and almost reverent. His touch was warm, steady. "I have never met a woman who did not flinch," he whispered. "I have never met a man who did not hide," she answered. Something broke open in his expression. Not weakness, relief. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to step away. She did not. When his lips touched hers, the kiss was gentle at first, unsure, then deeper, filled with weeks of unspoken feeling and months of honest letters. When they parted, both were breathing harder. "Abigail," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "marry me. Not because I am a duke, not because this house needs a mistress, but because I cannot imagine this place without you in it." Her heart pounded, but her voice did not tremble. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will stay." Below them, the great manor stood silent against the falling snow. But for the first time in many years, Black Ridge Manor did not feel like a fortress of shadows. It felt like the beginning of a home. The wedding took place in early spring, when the last snow had melted from the mountains and the river below Black Ridge Manor ran full and bright. Abigail stood in the small stone chapel near the estate, sunlight pouring through tall, clear windows. She wore a simple ivory gown her father had helped sew, with lace borrowed from a neighbor back in Willow Creek. There were no grand city guests, no crowded ballroom, no orchestra. Only a handful of ranch hands, a few servants, and her father, and Nathaniel's oldest friend from the war. It was quiet, and it was perfect. Nathaniel stood at the front, tall and steady in a dark suit. The scar that once kept women at a distance seemed now like a mark of strength. His gray eyes did not leave Abigail's face as she walked toward him on her father's arm. Reverend Harper's voice carried clearly in the small chapel. "Marriage is not built on comfort alone," he said gently. "It is built on truth, patience, and the daily choice to remain." Abigail felt the weight of those words. She had chosen to remain when others fled. When Nathaniel slipped the gold band onto her finger, his hand trembled slightly. "I vow," he said, his voice low but firm, "to stand beside you in silence and in storm, to honor your mind as much as your heart, to never hide from you, or even when it would be easier." Abigail held his gaze. "I vow," she replied, "to stay when fear whispers to run, to speak truth with kindness, to walk beside you, not behind you, and to remind you every day that you are more than your scars." When the ceremony ended and Nathaniel kissed her, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only certainty. Black Ridge Manor welcomed her not as a visitor, but as its duchess. The first months of marriage were not a fairy tale of endless ease. The mountains were still quiet. Nathaniel still woke some nights from memories that refused to fade. There were mornings when silence returned like an old habit. But Abigail did not retreat. When he grew withdrawn, she sat beside him without forcing words. When the house felt too heavy, she opened windows and let sunlight flood the halls. Yet she began inviting families from nearby ranches for small gatherings. Laughter slowly returned to rooms that had forgotten it. "You are changing this place," Nathaniel said one evening, as they stood in the great hall, now filled with fresh flowers and warm light. "No," she answered softly. "We are." She worked alongside the housekeeper to improve conditions for the staff. She visited ranch hands' families when illness came. She asked Nathaniel about the veterans who once served under him. "There are many who struggle," he admitted, "men who returned from war but never truly came home." "Then invite them," she said simply. And he did. Within a year, Black Ridge Manor became more than a lonely estate in the mountains. A small group of former soldiers came to work the land, repair fences, care for horses. Nathaniel met with them in the evenings, speaking openly of memories he once carried alone. Abigail started a small schoolroom in one of the unused wings of the manor for the children of workers and veterans. She filled shelves with books from the great library. She taught reading and writing beneath tall windows that once overlooked silence. The house began to breathe. One summer afternoon, as they stood together watching children run across the courtyard, Nathaniel turned to her. "I used to believe this manor was a burden," he said quietly, "a reminder of expectations I could not meet." "And now?" she asked. "Now it feels like a promise kept." She slipped her hand into his. "You wrote letters seeking a wife," she said with a faint smile. But what you truly sought was someone who would not fear the quiet. "And you," he replied, "were braver than I ever imagined." Years passed, and the change at Black Ridge became known throughout Colorado. Travelers who once whispered about the scarred Duke now spoke of the strong couple who built a haven in the mountains. Veterans found purpose on the land. Children found education within stone walls, once known only for shadow. Nathaniel entered public life again, advocating for support for former soldiers and rural schools. He no longer avoided gatherings in Denver. Abigail stood beside him, steady and proud. "You gave me back my voice," he told her once after a long meeting with state officials. "You never lost it," she said. "You only needed someone to listen." Their first child, a son named Samuel after her father, was born 3 years into their marriage. Nathaniel held the boy with awe, his large hands gentle. "I want him to grow, knowing strength is not silence," he whispered. "And that courage sometimes means staying," Abigail added. 2 years later came a daughter, Eleanor, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's firm spirit. Black Ridge Manor rang with laughter that echoed down long corridors. On a clear autumn evening, nearly 10 years after Abigail first stepped from that carriage, she stood once more in the tower room. The mountains glowed gold beneath the setting sun. Nathaniel came up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, just as they had on the night he asked her to stay. "Do you ever think about the others?" she asked quietly. "The women who left?" "Yes." He rested his chin against her shoulder. "I am grateful for them," he said honestly. "Grateful? If even one had stayed, I would never have known what it means to be truly seen." She turned in his arms. "You were always worthy of being seen," she said softly. "And you," he replied, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, "were always braver than you believed." Below them, the estate moved with life. Smoke curled from chimneys. Lights glowed in windows. Voices carried on the evening air. Black Ridge Manor no longer stood as a fortress against loneliness. It stood as proof. Proof that scars do not make a man unlovable. Proof that quiet does not mean cursed. Proof that when one person has the courage to stay, an entire life can change. The Duke who once wrote letters seeking a wife had found not just a duchess, but a partner, a friend, and the heart of his home. And the humble vicar's daughter who refused to flee had found not only love, but a purpose strong enough to echo through mountains for generations to come.